You're listening to Earshot. That was Canis Major and Canis Minor, a movement from Constellations for piano by composer David Liptak. That was performed by pianist Eunmi Ko, the president and founding member of the Contemporary Art Music Project. Today we will sit down with composer David Liptak and talk about some of his music, including Hocket, a piece for solo piano recently premiered on one of our Contemporary Art Music Project concerts. Hello and welcome to Earshot episode number 3. I'm sitting down today with composer David Liptak here at the Eastman School of Music to talk to him about some of the work he's been doing and some of the music he's been writing that's been performed by members of Contemporary Art Music Project, specifically our president and pianist Eunmi Ko. Thank you for being here, David Liptak.
It's my pleasure. I'm happy to speak with you.
We can start by, I think, introducing yourself and talking a little bit about the music that you've been writing and what's been sort of propelling you in these directions.
Well, that's a lot. I'll introduce myself briefly. I am a composer. I have been for the last 40 years also a teacher. My first job was at Michigan State University, and then I spent 6 years at the University of Illinois, and for the last 30, I think it's now 35 years, I've been at the Eastman School of Music. So I've been involved with a whole bunch, many younger composers, and it's really, I think, been one of the propelling and important things in my life. I've always composed, apart from that, jobs. It's a bit like having two jobs in a way. So most of my work that I do is collaborative. That means I work for players and I work on by fulfilling requests or on commission, and often these relationships with performers become really important to me in my professional work, and I'm hoping it'll be also meaningful to them. And one of those performers is the pianist Eunmi Ko, who I got to know when I visited the University of South Florida for the first time in the oh gosh, some years ago. I was there with John Graham. We were having a performance of my viola concerto for viola solo plus percussion quartet, and Robert McCormick had set that up. And then that I was introduced to Eunmi, who has been a real staunch supporter of my music, and I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah, I've sort of similar. I met Eunmi when I was a student at the University of South Florida, and she's also been someone who's helped me quite a bit. She's played some of my music and has been the performer that I've really enjoyed having a sort of relationship with to create music. And I think that's also, especially for me as a much younger composer and as someone sort of just starting out, I think I found that building those sorts of relationships has been really important to getting my music played and getting sort of interest in my music, or especially from performers. I think something like Contemporary Art Music Project or something like this allows for the more of that kind of relationship building, especially with someone like Eunmi, who's doing so much.
Oh, I agree with you completely. I've had some collaborators, like the baritone William Sharp, I've been working with ever since we were in graduate school together. I've written him 3 song cycles. He's done 3 recordings of my music on CD, and we continue to work. I'm writing a new piece. Well, I've written a new piece that's going to be performed in the spring for him, for soprano, baritone, and orchestra, which will be done here at the Eastman School in April. That collaboration is a lengthy one. My collaboration with Eunmi started much more recently, but it has been completely, successful, and I think for me a real source of inspiration for my work.
Yeah. So sort of going off of that, let's talk a little bit about or introduce Hocket, the piece that Eunmi premiered at this previous Contemporary Art Music concert. Could you introduce the piece a little bit and talk about sort of just the piece a little bit?
I think I can. Sometimes when I write music, I do it in a way which it's an invention on its own. I don't follow particular plans, and I have to say that now because Hocket was some music I'd written 2 or 3 decades ago, and I didn't tell this to Eunmi, so she'll be learning this when she hears this podcast. But it never really found its way into anything, in anything that I would want it to keep, and so I just kept it in my notebook on reserve. And it's not exactly what came out in this piano piece, which is, which was something that was based on that older collection of ideas. This Hocket is a kind of a real Hocket. I mean, where notes interlace with each other as the piece goes on, and it's more complicated than that. So you hear sometimes the things sounding together in harmonies, but it's definitely a contrapuntal piece. It's lively, it's short, it's a piece which I think is well suited to Eunmi's personality as a pianist, as I've come to know it to be from working with her on other larger pieces like my collection Constellations.
Yeah, I remember from listening to the premiere online, I was sort of struck by how much it connected with a lot of the ways that she's been playing other kinds of music. This sort of, I had a piece performed by her that was similarly very short and had a lot of sort of action, and I think that that's like really interesting and something that really fits with her personality. So we'll go ahead and play that piece now,
Okay.
and we can talk about it a little bit more after it's done. Yeah, so thank you very much about that piece. It was really beautiful.
Yeah. I want to say something about Eunmi's performance, and it's something that I look for in all my collaborators. This is something I really enjoy about music making, is that her interpretation of it is really her own. And I try to write my music, the notation. I try to make the notation so it allows for that to be a big part of what's going on. And she and other collaborators that I've worked with that I really value have shown me things in my music that would not have otherwise occurred to me that way. Even things which are, things that I would not have written. Sometimes they're put into a context which are very convincing and I'm very pleased about. So I enjoy that kind of working process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's something. As a composer, I also really value the input of performers on my work. I often find that I'm writing more for performers than for anyone else. It's sort of one of the primary things that I'm thinking about is sort of the performer's experience of my music.
Well, I think that's really healthy for a composer to do, to think about things in that way.
And I think especially as a performer, it sort of leads me to think that way. And so, is there, like, I know the piece is quite short, but is there anything you would add about the piece or about what you're sort of thinking about in this piece, or anything that comes to mind, anything else?
Yes, I think that there is just some interpretive, or rather expressive quality to it, which I just want to mention. And it's not really a fast piece. It's a rather slowly unfolding piece, and the tempo is not, extraordinary fast. It's moving, but it's not fast. It's a sort of a reflective piece. A lot of Hockets are not that. A lot of Hockets have a lot of spiking to them. Lots of stuff.
Or sort of jagged almost.
Yeah, that's right. But this one is different. It's a kind of almost remembering back kind of Hocket.
Yeah, I know, and that sort of typical sort of jagged, almost rough around the edges feeling of a Hocket is not in this piece. It's a very smooth and continuous sort of flowing piece. And I really enjoy it. Thank you very much for sharing it with us. So I sort of want to pivot and talk a little bit more. You had mentioned talking about sort of composing and being a teacher, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about that because I think some of the composers we've had on so far aren't really teachers or aren't really doing sort of working in a university setting or doing this sort of thing. So I wonder if there's maybe a sort of conversation that we can have about what you sort of value about the combination of teaching and composing, or what you think the role of teaching is in your composing. Because this is a conversation I've had with a couple of composers. I know it's kind of a strange question, but a couple of composers about sort of how their the work that they're doing as teachers has affected them as a composer.
Sure. I understand your question, by the way. I mean, there are several different parts to it.
Yeah. Not just like how your students immediately impact you, but also sort of just how the sort of practice of teaching in general sort of affects you, I guess.
Right. I guess I want to start this by saying something about, there are teachers who do, in fact, by virtue of the composition they do, instruct their students. That's a large part of it. There's always a dialogue, which is apart from that. But basically, you study with a master, and the master has this way of working, and you try to emulate it or learn it. I don't think I've ever been like that, I'm afraid. I think that way of teaching is, in fact, valuable, but I have trouble doing that. I really am interested in my teaching in two things. I'm getting as precise idea of the kind of vision the student has for writing a piece. And then the second part is to work very specifically on the mechanics of making the piece based on that idea. Understanding what is not music yet is difficult, but it comes a little more easily as you get to know your students better. You understand the way they work and how they think, and it seems a little bit easier to sort of understand to understand what they're saying when they describe the kind of piece they want to write. Mm-hmm. And I've always enjoyed getting inside that process. I hardly ever demonstrate my own music for my students, but of course we're in a school and we hear music everywhere, and I'm sure that they know my work, but I don't use my work in my lessons as illustratory. Mm-hmm. We pay some attention to other pieces, but in some ways it's more of a help in teasing out the idea and working with them the process of making some sort of notational realization of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. I know that I feel like, we spend so much time talking to composers about composing. It's kind of nice to talk about teaching sometimes as a sort of supplement to that.
Mm-hmm.
So let's move on to your piece Constellations, which is a much larger work than Hocket. It's sort of is both in length and sort of I tend to feel like conceptually it sort of covers more ground. So could you introduce this piece a little bit, and we'll probably play some excerpts, specifically the excerpts that Eunmi performed on the same concert that premiered Hocket, and then we'll probably add in a couple other excerpts if you would like to add some more.
Oh, okay, thank you. I wrote Constellations in 2010, and it was for a pianist whose name is Zuzana Zevcek, who was at that time in the doctoral program studying here at Eastman. And it was, I wanted to write a big piece. I hadn't done that yet. I've written small pieces for the piano, but I wanted to write a large collection. I was interested in writing a piece which had some sort of unity to it in the way it was structured. So from the start, I decided that I would pursue one of my other more of a hobby interests, which is astrology. No, I didn't mean that. I meant astronomy. But I really liked the stories of the constellations, and I like imagining stars, and I like trying in the asterisms and find out what kind of constellations they belong to. It's been an interest of mine. So I thought I would try to structure the piece that way. And from the start, I decided to write a piece, and each piece would be identified with a constellation that was in the southern sky. So we don't usually see it here in Rochester, New York. It's in the southern hemisphere. Also, I decided not to use any of the constellations that are part of the zodiac. And that was sort of intentional. I realized I was kind of, in writing this piece, I was following in the footsteps of George Crumb's Macrocosmos.
Yeah, that was something that I immediately sort of identified with the piece. I sort of noticed that connection.
Yeah, and so I didn't want to do zodiacal pieces. I didn't want to deny that relationship, however, when I was a student at Eastman as well. And when I was in my graduate studies at Eastman, I played on one of the Music Innova concerts, the first volume of Macrocosmos, when it was almost new. It was 1974, I think, and I played it on that concert. And so I knew that collection of pieces, and later the second book, the third book, and the fourth book. I know all of those pieces really, really well. There are things that I decided to do in writing my piece which were deliberately not identified with Crumb's music. For example, everything I write is on the keys. I don't use the zodiacal constellations in the themes of things going on. And these pieces, and there are 9 in my set, are they're different in the way they're put together in length and in other ways. I think if I wanted to make a comparison to an earlier composition, I would have to go all the way back to Schumann and Kreisleriana, which is a piece I really love, and it's a big part of what Constellations, I think, sort of grows from. But in any case, I chose the Constellations so that the 9 pieces were divided in 3 groups of 3. The first group usually has something to do with a big figure, a hunter like Orion. The second has something to do with animals. The third has something to do with a bird. And the third of each of the 3 groups of 3 also uses a quote of Robert Schumann, which is either pretty obvious or really hidden, almost beyond recognition.
Yeah. No, I didn't know the connection with Schumann. I wasn't super familiar with that aspect of the work. But certainly with the sort of Crumb connection, just because of the sort of almost very surface level symbolism of the work, they sort of align in that way. No, I think these pieces I was introduced to through Eunmi's performance of them. I believe she performed some at USF while I was there, and then with the release of her recordings of them that were really quite incredible. Those are probably the recordings that I'll play in this podcast.
That's good.
Yeah. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that recording as well, because I know that sort of was part of that collaboration with Eunmi.
Right.
Which also has the percussion, or the concerto for piano and percussion working with Robert McCormick.
Well, Eunmi asked about playing my music some years ago, some maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And in connection with one of my visits down there to Tampa, she decided that she would be learning some of the pieces of Constellations. I think she started slow. She did 2 or 3 of them. But then she learned the entire set and was using that as part of her repertoire. And she plays them fantastically, really just in every way. They're just exactly what I want to hear. Her interpretation and the first pianist's interpretation are different, and I love them both. I like the differences between them. Eunmi had then determined that what she would want to do, I think, is to record them along with something else which we hadn't decided yet. Robert McCormick was the one who suggested a concerto with percussion, and he had done 2 of my pieces so far, so he knew my work, and I thought that was a great idea. So I took it up.
He does those projects fairly often with tends to be sort of piano or instrument and percussion ensemble works. When he's at USF, he was doing those quite a bit with the percussion group there.
Yeah. Well, there's a whole series of concertos that for Eunmi.
There are a lot of them. For Eunmi. And Matthew Barber wrote one.
Right, Matt Barber and Baljinder Second.
Yeah, Baljinder wrote one, and several other composers, actually, most of them connected to Eastman, wrote pieces for that.
Most, but not all.
Not all, but yeah.
Another one who wrote for them was Anthony Green.
Yes, Anthony Green wrote one. Another really amazing piece that Eunmi's performed. I really love that piece. It's a piece that I plan on having on a future podcast, hopefully having Anthony Green on as well.
Oh, that would be terrific,
Well, thank you so much for joining us today and sitting down to talk about this. I've really enjoyed sort of having you on and being able to introduce these pieces and talk a little bit more about Contemporary Art Music Project and Eunmi on this podcast. So shout out to Eunmi for all of the great work that she's doing.
I wish for camp great success. I think it's a wonderful effort, and I hope things go well into the future.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks again from here in the studio to David Liptak for sitting down with me and talking about some of his work and sharing some insightful information about himself and his practice. To conclude today's episode, I'm going to play some more selections from Constellations performed by Eunmi Ko. This is Cygnus, Cassiopeia, and Vulpecula. If you'd like to check out these recordings, you can find them on David Liptak's album Constellations, recorded by our pianist Eunmi Ko. I'll include a link to that in the show notes.